Croissants. Croissants. Crispy moon thingies. Le croissant. Un croissant. Croissants. What's going on, gang? My name is Kieran Tyanapalin, and I'm going to teach you how to make croissants today. In terms of equipment, the only thing that we're going to need is a rolling pin. If you don't have a rolling pin, that's okay. Just use an empty wine bottle as your makeshift rolling apparatus. Personally, I like a nice and heavy stainless steel rolling pin because it has cooling properties and non-stick properties. Our recipe is going to be split up into 3 different days with 2 phases. The first phase will essentially be the making of our initial dough, or détrempe in French, and the second phase will be taking our butter block, locking our butter block into our détrempe, and then making our folds, which is essentially the lamination phase.
Alright gang, I wasn't exactly truthful. You are also going to need to get a digital scale to do the recipe. So we're going to go ahead and start weighing our ingredients. First step is to bloom our yeast. We're going to take 65 grams of water and 5 grams of dry yeast. Instant or active, I suggest you bloom it properly and you let it sit. If you are using fresh, I suggest you double the amount. Just make sure that when you add it to your détrempe, we keep it separate from the salt because it is a yeast killer. To bloom your yeast, you're going to want to give it a good mix. Make sure it's well incorporated, and you're just going to want to set that aside while we gather our other ingredients. In a new mixing bowl, we're going to weigh 125 grams of bread flour. Bread flour has a little bit more elasticity, so when it comes to rolling out our dough, it'll be a little bit easier. And we're also going to add 125 grams of all-purpose flour, which will help us get a starchier finished product. After that, you're going to want to add 25 grams of sugar, 7 grams of milk powder, as well as 6 grams of kosher salt. Give it a good flick of the wrist and add 20 grams of softened butter. After that, we're going to go ahead with our wet. We're going to add 65 grams of cold milk, as well as our previous yeast mixture. Once we have all our ingredients, we're going to want to go ahead and start mixing. So use a clean set of paws and just do some round circle motion thingies, just until you start to see that things are combining, and you should end up with something like this. A little bit more of a shaggy mass, but you can see that we're starting to get some gluten development. At this point, we're going to transfer our shaggy mass onto our workbench, and we're going to start forming our dough. This is also the point where things start to get a little messy. I suggest you use something like the flat end of a bowl scraper to keep everything nice and tight. You're going to want to go ahead and just gently knead your mixture until you have a dough ball. It shouldn't take more than 2 minutes. We're looking for low gluten development. Once our dough is formed, we can wrap it and let it ferment overnight. After that, we're going to want to go ahead and make our butter block. So you're going to want to fold a big piece of parchment paper into a little piece of parchment paper, a 14 by 14 centimeter packet that we'll use to encase our butter and roll out into our shape so it's ready to laminate. So open it back up and smack your butter in the middle and make sure you scrape all the goods because you need all of it. And then we're going to fold everything back up and just hammer it out until smooth and roll out the corners. Personally, I find this stage of the recipe oddly therapeutic. So you're going to want to go ahead and take your butter block and refrigerate overnight. Day 2, we're going to flour our workspace and degas that mass. Make sure you get all the air out, and we're going to form our dough into a rectangle so that we can receive our butter. Gently stretch it out, and we're going to add our butter block in the middle, but make sure it is the same texture as your dough. It is imperative that your butter stays cold, but it's still malleable for the lock-in phase. Go ahead and take both of your flaps and fold them in. If our butter block was 14 centimeters in width, we're going to have to make sure that our dough is 28 overall, and we're going to crimp all our sides. Once we are locked in, we will flour our workspace again, and we're going to take our rolling pin and gently press to enclose our butter, and we're going to roll out our dough. Make sure you don't press too hard. We don't want to heat our dough up too much and have our butter fuse into the dough. This is really important, especially when you're laminating. Once you have a centimeter in height all the way through, you're going to perform a book fold. Grab an extremity of your dough and fold it back onto itself out about a quarter of the way through, and take the other third and bring them into the middle. Take one side and fold it back onto itself. Wrap it and let it rest in the fridge for at least 30 minutes. Following your half-hour siesta, we're going to pin our dough back down and just get it back to working consistency, making sure there's no hard pieces of butter left in our laminated dough. This is crucial because we'd like to avoid any hard pieces of butter ripping through any of our layers during the rollout phase. Once you've pinned it down sufficiently, you're going to want to go ahead and roll out your dough again, making sure you don't apply too much elbow grease because we don't want our layers to fuse together. Once we've rolled our dough back to about a centimeter in height and 36 centimeters in length, you're going to perform a single fold. Fold a third of your dough back onto itself, making sure there's not a lot of flour residue remaining, and then take the other side and fold it back onto itself. After we've completed our single fold, which is the final fold of our laminated dough, we're going to go ahead and freeze our dough. So wrap it and put it in a freezer bag. And this is just to control the fermentation because we don't want it to overproof overnight. You always want to keep into account your working conditions. If it is incredibly hot, I'd suggest you chill your slab or countertop, or even crank the AC up to keep everything favorable. Always keep in mind the working conditions that you are in. If your kitchen is incredibly warm, I'd suggest you take precautions. Go ahead and thaw your dough either on the countertop for a couple hours or just let it thaw in the fridge. We're going to want to go ahead and pin our dough back down for the final roll, just gently pressing down and making sure we have no butter shards until we're able to roll it out fully. At this point in the recipe, you could see your dough potentially fighting back. If that's the case, put it back in the fridge and let it rest for about 15 minutes and roll it out again. Once your dough is rested, you're going to want to go ahead and start making your cuts. My dough is rolled out to about 34 by 24. You're just going to want to cut 3 equal strips, so 2 cuts down the line. You don't have to measure this. I just eyeball it. I don't think it really needs to be an exact science, but just make 2 equal cuts down the length of your dough. You can always square off your dough. If you do, I'd suggest taking those scraps and making something like morning buns with them. To make our triangle shapes, we're going to cut from one corner diagonally down to the next corner across. You're going to go ahead and do that 3 times to get 6 triangles. I suggest you use a sharp knife to do this because we want to maintain those wonderful layers and not crush them. Once you've made all your cuts, you can go ahead and begin rolling. First, a more traditional version would be to make a cut at the bottom of your triangle and then make a Tour Eiffel-like shape and stretch towards you. You can stretch away or towards you, it's just a preference that I have. Stretch both of your legs, and then fold, and then gently roll back up to the tip. Once you've gotten back to the tip, gently press it down to ensure the tip is at the bottom and it is sealed. When rolling, you want to make sure you're using your fingertips as much as possible and avoid your palms. Reason being is if we use our palms, they're going to transfer a lot more heat and we risk melting that butter. So another method would just be to not actually make that cut at the bottom and just to do a normal stretch, fold, and roll. Always making sure we keep that tip nice and sealed at the bottom. Roll with whichever technique you feel more comfortable with. Make sure you work relatively quickly to ensure that you don't have any butter melting. Once you've rolled out all your croissants, I'd suggest you pop them back in the cooler to rest a little bit more and to get back to a cooler internal temperature, just because we don't want to risk having any butter melting during our proofing stage. Once your croissants have chilled, line a half pan with parchment paper. Place your chilled croissants onto the pan and add a container of hot water from the tap. Not boiling, but still warm to touch. Pop a lid on it. I'm just using a plastic storage box, but you could easily do this in your oven closed with a little bowl of warm water. Your croissants proof. You might have to switch the water in between like me because it wasn't hot enough, but just make sure that you are monitoring it because it could take an hour, it could take 3. It really depends on how hot the ambient temperature is. Once our croissants have doubled in size and are nice and jiggly, we can go ahead and apply our egg wash. To get our egg wash mixture, we're just going to take a whole egg and add a dash of water and mix. Gently brush your egg wash over the surface of your croissants, making sure that you're not going over the exposed layers and sealing them. I want to make a quick note. Get a pastry brush with boar bristles. This thing is terrible. After we've applied our egg wash, we can bake our croissants for 20 minutes at 200 degrees Celsius. If you like them bien cuits, let them go a little bit longer. Transfer your croissants to a resting rack and let them rest. Don't be an eager beaver, let them rest. Do not take a bite out of these until they're at a good temperature. You don't want blisters on your tongue. Gross. This is the point where I bid all of you adieu, say goodbye to voiceover Kieran, because I will let the wonderful sounds of my handmade viennoiserie take the wheel.
So now you know how to make croissant dough. You can go ahead and turn around and make some amandines or some pain au raisin, but just have fun with it. Don't be discouraged if you do miss a couple steps or if something goes awry. That's okay. I'm sure that some of the best touriers and pâtissiers have tough days. But thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Bye.